You heard there Phil LeBeau saying that the chairman, Calhoun, would not go to the question of how much money this debacle is ultimately going to cost Boeing, but I assume you can. How much is it going to cost them? What kind of charges do you expect them to take? And why don't you just walk through some of the numbers?
So today we issued a report that suggested the total charges that are visible amount to roughly $8 billion. However, that would not account for any type of airline compensation that still might be issued as well. So our modeling is 8 now, but we think it could be as high as $13 billion, and that will ultimately force the company to look to raise debt in the next quarter.
So he said he was going to keep the dividend because the company has the financial wherewithal to pay it. So he's no reason not to do that. Is he right?
Our free cash flow assumptions are pretty low. We have them doing only about $2 billion for 2020. So if they're not going to cut the dividend, they're going to need to raise a considerable amount of debt. So that would be the question and how investors react to that.
So finally, what is the impact on earnings per share in 2020? What's your model say?
Well, I think there's 2 issues that are out there now that are ahead of what we think is going to be the kitchen sink issue next week during a conference call. The first is a much later than expected starting point for the 737 MAX, which we assume for August now. But what I think investors are not accounting for is when production does start, it'll be somewhere around 21 to 28 units per month, which is below the 42. And that drives our earnings assumption to about $10 per share, but it could go lower based on the account.
$10 down from what? Down from what it would have been. What would it have been?
It was around $17 per share at the beginning of January.
All right, let's talk about how these planes get back into the air. When you hear Calhoun, Jim, say that it's not a wiring issue, it's not a software issue, that it may be an issue of getting these pilots trained on the simulator, how do you factor that into what your expectations are for returning the MAX to service?
The way we look at...
Sorry. Chris, go ahead.
The way we look at...
I think it has been a credibility issue from the very beginning, and that started right after the first event. And I think the chairman's right. I mean, Boeing has cried wolf too many times, and he's addressing the credibility, obviously, on Wall Street. But I think he needs to also address the credibility with his own employees and with the flying public. He may find that gap's a little bigger than he likes.
But, Jim, do you think that he did that when he says he got down on the ground and that there's been a hit to the anxiety of the employees there in Washington State?
Yeah, that's why I have suggested they ought to bring in Alan Mulally, who was the architect of the 777, very successful at Ford, was passed over by the money changers at Boeing and went to Ford. He's from the Boeing family. I'd bring him in as a safety czar and give him the responsibility of rebuilding the safety culture at the company and getting this airplane in the air.
So, Chris, obviously, as you lower the price target from where it is today, you had a 300, I think it was, back a couple of weeks ago, down to 280. You do not think in any way that all the bad news is already priced into this stock?
I think we haven't even heard the worst case scenario as relates to the 737 MAX. But keep in mind, there are other factors at play. For example, does Boeing need to cut production on their 787 aircraft, which is currently not seeing any orders? And how do we think about the 777X, which is having its own problems on top of that? So I still think there's bad news, and the stock needs to trade lower before it can go higher.
Jim, from your perspective, what other bad news could still be coming out of Boeing?
Of course, we haven't heard from the final investigations, and particularly from the Department of Justice. So we don't know what all the ramifications of the investigations are that have been currently underway. What we do know is that Boeing has been unable to stop the bleeding. We had the example this week of the 2009 Turkish accident where it had similarities that should have been picked up immediately when they had problems with the 737 MAX. So it makes you wonder, what do they know about safety? Does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? are these comments that were made and distributed by the employees about the dysfunction still in existence?
So, Jim, do I interpret you correctly that you can foresee a scenario where there might be criminal charges brought either against the company Boeing corporately or against individuals and maybe high-ranking executives there? Is that a scenario that you contemplate?
Well, obviously, I don't know what the Justice Department is going to decide. All I know is that there is an investigation underway, and at some point there will be a result of that investigation.